And you most certainly have not launched all at once like we're trying today. The CAG, Commander Pierce, listed off the instructions one final time. Each fighter, in its turn, would launch exactly 1/3 of a second after the one before it. All 150 of them. The accelerations would be gut-churning, the distances between fighters uncomfortably small. There was no room for error on this one. And the giant osmium brick tied to the undercarriage of each fighter more than doubled each craft's mass. Maneuvering would be difficult. The Granger Omega-3 maneuver. Omega, an appropriate term. It would most likely be the last thing they ever did. He glanced to his left, down the line of fighters with their engines idling. Space Champ, Pew Pew, and his brother Fodder. He'd sure miss them. Commander Pierce's voice cut through his headset. Stand by. 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Now! To his right, the line of fighters started shooting out the giant bay door one at a time every 0.33 seconds. Much of it was computer-controlled, but not the actual maneuvering. When his time came, the engines roared to life automatically, and he barely had time to steer the nose of his fighter out towards the exit and space beyond. 50 seconds later, they were all in position, forming a vast halo around the ISS Warrior. 30-some-odd heavy cruisers bunched up tightly behind the giant tungsten-armored carrier, all of them blazing toward the planet ahead of them. In orbit above that ravaged world stood the largest swarm ship any of them had ever seen. It was still a tiny dot, but it grew larger. "All craft," came Pierce's voice. "Brick launch on my mark." Balls checked the computer calculations one more time, ensuring his thrusters were linked appropriately to the targeting computer. All clear. "Launch." He flew back against his seat as the fighter leapt forward and to starboard, and moments later he felt the telltale clank as the osmium brick detached. A moment later he reversed thrust, aligning his nose with the edge of the Warrior's bulk, and maneuvered his fighter around the ship. There was no time for all of them to land in the fighter bay, and staying out to fight during the flyby was pointless. All they could do was hide in the shadow of the Warrior like the rest of the cruisers. Hide and pray. The rest of the cruisers. Hide and pray. Chapter 5. Starfreighter Lucky Bandit. Low orbit. Indira, Britannia sector. Something seemed dreadfully wrong. They're coming in way too fast. That doesn't make any sense. Rodriguez studied the sensor readout, even as he pointed the nose of the freighter on a trajectory that would eventually let them break orbit and make their first Q-jump. "Whatever," said the pilot. "As long as they keep the bastards distracted while we make our getaway. And it's not just us, there's thousands of other freighters and colonial transports trying to make a break for..." Thousands of tiny explosions leapt out from the super dreadnought. "Ah, damn!" Rodriguez watched the scene unfold in amazement. Granger, with his fleet coming in close behind, had oriented the Warrior so the bottom face of its hull was fully exposed to the super dreadnought and its two smaller companions. But peeking out from the shadow of the Warrior were hundreds of mag-rail turrets from the tightly packed fleet of cruisers, each ship positioned such that its hull was protected by the Warrior, but with a clear enough view of the super dreadnought that it could fire several steady streams of ultra-high-velocity mag-rail slugs. Which they did. Thousands of impacts erupted all over the massive super dreadnought. It, along with the two escort carriers, opened up a devastating volley on the rapidly approaching Warrior, raking the underside of its hull with dozens of antimatter beams. Rodriguez could only imagine the destruction on the lower decks. "Pretty gutsy. But they're flying past in less than 10 seconds. I still don't see how much good it'll do," said Rav, shaking his head. "Watch. I see it now," interrupted Rodriguez, pointing at the sensors. They just barely detected over 100 small projectiles which rocketed away from the Warrior. Small, but thousands of times larger than the standard mag-rail slug, and traveling at 50 kilometers a second. The incoming IDF fleet, still sheltered by the Warrior, continued pummeling the super dreadnought, some ships even turning their attention to the two swarm carriers. But Rodriguez understood it now. The conventional fire was a ruse. Moments later, his suspicion was confirmed with a violent, eye-piercing explosion. 150 eye-piercing explosions. I don't believe it. Raph couldn't take his eyes off the disintegrating super dreadnought. From the 150 massive gaping holes erupted 150 streams of debris, smoke, and fire all up and down the 100 kilometers long spine of the ship. I don't believe it, he repeated breathlessly. That's Granger for you. Rodriguez pushed hard on the accelerator. Now that the swarm ships in the immediate vicinity were focused like a laser on the IDF fleet, it was the perfect chance to hightail it out of there. They still can't win. Even without that super dreadnought, there are over 20 swarm carriers in orbit. Granger only has 36 ships. Plus, he came in so fast he'll be flung out toward the outer solar system unless he can miraculously arrest his velocity in the next 2 minutes. Rodriguez shook his head. He'll figure something out. He always does. The pilot regarded him for a moment in disbelief, like an atheist, skeptically eyeing the firm faith of a sincere believer, but he shrugged and began plotting their course toward a point where it would be safe to make the Q-jump. Or at least that was his intention. Instead, he gawked at the sensor readout again. Yeah, but what's he gonna do about that? Rodriguez's eye followed the pilot's outstretched finger. The sensor readout had more bad news. Its outstretched finger. The sensor readout had more bad news. Chapter 6. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Indira, Britannia Sector. Granger was beginning to regret his order. The Granger Omega-3 maneuver was wreaking havoc down on the lower decks. The ship trembled and shook violently. The super dreadnought and its 2 accompanying carriers were unloading everything they had straight into the Warrior's gut, tearing their lower hull to shreds. But the results spoke for themselves. After 20 seconds of fleet bombardment, the super dreadnought was beginning to show signs of extreme duress, to put it lightly. Massive power fluctuations coming from the dreadnought, Ensign Diamond yelled over his console. Granger nodded and inclined his head toward Commander Proctor. Brick status? Longin 10. He studied the sensor readouts coming from the super dreadnought and then waved over to the comm station. Send a fleet. Retarget accompanying vessels. Aye, sir, said Ensign Prucha. Moments later, the IDF fleet, protected under the shadow of the Warrior, redirected fire toward the other 2 swarm ships hovering near the super dreadnought, which also began to erupt with thousands of small explosions where the magrail slugs ripped into their hulls. These 3 buggers are toast, Granger thought. But he was paying for it, dearly. The bridge jolted to starboard violently as several of the incoming antimatter beams connected with one of the main inertial cancellors. Those things were embedded at least 5 decks within the lower hull. Damn, they were cutting deep. The bridge jerked again, and out of the corner of his eye, he saw the Marines stationed near the bridge entranceway sway and struggle to remain on their feet. Granger counted silently in his head the remaining seconds, and moments later Proctor announced, Brick launch, impact in 5. Prepare for attitude realignment. Put it on screen, said Granger, gripping his armrests ferociously to steady himself against the violent buffeting of the incoming storm of antimatter beams. At least we'll get to enjoy the show. Just moments after the view screen focused on the swarm super dreadnought, which had redirected its fire to the incoming osmium projectiles in a vain attempt to destroy them, the gaping holes appeared in blinding explosions as large chunks of the hull were blasted away. Each osmium brick, though only a few tons, was moving so fast that it slammed into the massive vessel with the energy of over 100 megaton-class nuclear warheads. And even though the ship was dozens of kilometers long, it was no match for explosive energy on that scale. As Warrior and the rest of the fleet flew by at nearly 50 kilometers per second, reorienting itself so the smaller cruisers would remain in the shadow of Granger's ship, the super dreadnought shuddered as it disintegrated into hundreds of smaller, smoking pieces. Excited whoops and cheers erupted on the bridge, and Granger, for the first time that day, allowed himself a small smile. Full reverse. 2 times safety limits. Settle us into an orbit that will take us to the next cluster of swarm carriers. Commander Proctor looked up from her status board. Heavy damage on the lower decks, sir. Main inertial cancellors are out. Numerous casualties on decks 6 and 7. Her face tightened into a pained expression.
They nearly cut all the way up to main engineering, Captain. Just a few more seconds and we would have been goners.
How much thrust can we sustain?
They had to arrest some of their speed, otherwise they'd fling out from the planet, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the battle, leaving the ravaged planet to its doom. From the looks of his planetary sensor readout, the swarm had already devastated dozens of cities with singularity blasts, likely killing millions. Tens of millions. But there were still a handful of major cities left, and hundreds of smaller towns that had to be defended.
Auxiliaries are only rated at half the safety limits of the primaries.
And full reverse. Double the safety standards of the auxiliaries.
He punched the internal comm.
Hold on, folks. We're about to have a rough ride.
He noticed Proctor shoot him a raised eyebrow.
Again,
he added. As the reverse thrusters engaged, they were thrown back against their seat restraints, then forward, then backward again as the inertial canceller struggled to keep up, swinging like a pendulum between the extreme acceleration vectors they were trying to balance. The deck plate seemed to groan, and Granger could hear the screeching of twisting metal deep within the walls. How much more could the old bird take? He shook his head. Damn it. The old bird was dead, still sitting on the main boulevard in South Salt Lake City, where it had crash-landed and skidded to a halt, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. IDF engineers had decided to leave it there, building up a giant scaffold around the broken hulk as they performed a refit. The goal was to restore her, though she wouldn't be ready for months yet. But he still hadn't shaken the habit of calling the warrior his old bird. He heard a groan from the sensor station, and almost simultaneously he heard Proctor mutter a curse. He glanced over at her.
I'm almost afraid to ask.
She looked up, her face taking on an almost resigned expression, as if she knew this battle would be their last.
2 more. Super dreadnoughts just Q-jumped in. They'll intercept our course in 5 minutes.
The math was starting to weigh on Granger's mind. 20 swarm carriers still orbited the planet, pummeling its already ravaged surface. Less than a third of the planet's population likely was still alive. 2 new dreaded super dreadnoughts to deal with. The warrior was a wreck. Admiral Zingano with his fleet was occupied with its own invasion light years away.
Sir?
Proctor said, eyeing him. He sighed.
Prepare for Q-jump.
He sighed.
Prepare for Q-jump.
Chapter 7. Bridge. ISS Warrior. Indira, Britannia Sector. The bridge fell quiet in the aftermath of his order to Q-jump. From the way they eyed him, it was clear that they were expecting to make a strategic withdrawal, to stand and fight another day, somewhere else. He saw in their eyes that it pained them, but that they were prepared to do it. To run. But Granger had never retreated. Ever. And he wasn't about to start.
Prepare for Q-jump to these coordinates,
he said, punching in a set of numbers and sending them to the helm. Ensign Prince looked at them, finally understanding Granger's meaning.
We're making another pass?
You got it, Ensign.
He looked around the bridge.
Any objections?
No one spoke. Before he could continue, Commander Proctor cleared her throat.
We're all behind you, Captain,
she began, but he could see in her eyes what she was going to say, that strategic withdrawal was smarter, but he wasn't going to have any of it. He'd lectured her and Zingano, and all the other captains more times than he could count. Stand your ground and fight. Make the swarm pay for every single system they took. Never retreat. Show no weakness of will. It was either that or fight them, and retreat from them, at the next world, and the next, and the next. No. The swarm needed to be taught that humanity would never, ever, ever back down. Eventually they would learn, calculate their own losses, and realize that they would never truly win until every last human outpost was utterly obliterated.
Good,
he said, leaving Proctor with her mouth left half open.
Sir, if I may, our lower hull is breached in 36 locations. Engineering is a mess. Our fighters are all back in the bay, and none have been reloaded with a brick yet. And you're sending us into another Granger Omega-3 against 2 of those super dreadnoughts? Surely there's something else that can be done at this point.
He sighed. She was right, of course, but there was simply no alternative. He held up his hands.
If you have a better idea, Commander, I'm all ears.
With any other officer, he'd have them removed from the bridge. But Proctor had saved his ass more times than he could count. Still, their relationship had been strained over the past 2 months. Ever since that fighter pilot, Vols, had returned with Fishtail, claiming that he'd just escaped from a swarm-controlled Captain Granger on the other side of the Singularity. She'd defended him. Hell, Zingano had defended him against General Norton, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and though he'd kept his command, suspicions around him were high ever since.
Split the fleet. Send everyone in 3s and 4s and engage the carriers. They're all spread out singly in various orbits. We'd last longer that way and take out more of their fleet. And if we're lucky, Zingano will show up before we're all dead.
Admiral Zingano to the rescue. Damn it, that was Granger's job. But she was right, of course. And he wasn't going to let his pride get in the way of the best outcome. That was something a politician would do, and damn it, he was not a politician. He was not an Avery, or worse, an Isaacson.
Do it.
He pointed to the tactical station.
Assign targets. Focus on those heading toward the remaining large population centers. Commander?
He said, turning back to her.
Make the fleet assignments.
She nodded, focusing her attention to splitting up the fleet and informing the other captains. She looked back up.
And where will we be going, sir?
My previous order stands. When our fleet has dispersed on their assignments, we make the Q jump.
He watched the view screen as the planet began to pull away. They were still on their highly elliptical course.
Straight down the throats of the 2 super dreadnoughts.
Proctor hesitated.
Alone?
Alone.
Alone?
Alone.
Chapter 8. Star Freighter Lucky Bandit. High Orbit. Indira, Britannia Sector. Lieutenant Rodriguez could hardly believe his eyes. Just minutes ago, he was watching the largest warship he'd ever seen begin launching its horrifying rain of fire down onto his homeworld, razing vast swaths of a continent, and the next moment that same ship was in pieces. It was impossible. He'd always suspected that the stories surrounding the hero of Earth were embellished and shaded with hyperbole, that the crew around Granger and the people he'd saved tended to be over the top in their praise of him. If anything, these stories were cheap, fanciful lies compared to what he had just witnessed. You know, I think that maybe, just maybe, we might make it out of this, he said. Raff, the pilot, nodded slowly, his eyes still wide at watching the ongoing destruction of the super dreadnought. Yeah, I think you might be right. A moment later, he came out of it and cranked on the controls. Watch out for those fighters. Rodriguez nodded. Look. He pointed toward the pieces of the dreadnought, which were starting to break up into smaller, red-hot chunks. The fighters are hightailing it out of there. Let's thread the needle. You mean fly into that storm of wreckage coming off that thing? Oh, no, not through it. Just close enough and around it so we can avoid these fighters. Raff shook his head, but then seeing the cloud of swarm fighters approach, he relented. Rodriguez steered the freighter toward the fragmenting dreadnought. Soon the hundreds of bogies faded into the background behind them as they approached one of the large pieces of wreckage, a section of hull nearly a kilometer long. We're too close, said Raff nervously. We're fine. He pulled up on the controls and whipped them around the side hull section, which, to Rodriguez's surprise, disappeared in a flash. Not an explosive flash, but a bright white flash. He'd seen that light before. Be on the lookout for... He was about to warn Raff about the singularities. They could be so small that you'd never see one until you were right on top of it. But he didn't have time. It was right in their path, shimmering, deadly. The cockpit turned brilliantly white for a split second, and Rodriguez felt as if his head had just taken a direct hit. He fought against the rising sleep with its promise of peaceful oblivion. He knew he was close to passing out, but he needed to stay awake to steer the freighter to safety. His life depended on it. His kids depended on it. The view through the windows had changed. Instead of giant pieces of the shattered super dreadnought set against the backdrop of Indira, he saw only one piece, falling toward a swirling maelstrom of material. Rocks, ice, debris, dust, all falling into and colliding with a central mass. They were falling too. Their engines were out. He felt his consciousness slipping away. The last thing he saw was the surface of the giant ball of material looming up, filling the entire window. Hundreds of rocks struck the outside hull like a million hailstones in a hailstorm. Even their relentless cacophony could not keep Rodriguez awake. Even their relentless cacophony could not keep Rodriguez awake. Chapter 9. Bridge, ISS Warrior, Indira, Britannia Sector.
Time,
Granger asked.
Still 2 minutes until we've matched the velocity of the incoming dreadnoughts, Captain,
said Ensign Diamond. He nodded.
Q jump in 1. We'll decelerate the rest of the way once we've made the jump. That'll give us some time to assess the tactical situation.
Proctor eyed him warily. What is there to assess? Her eyes wondered. Even though she said nothing, he answered her unasked question.
We still have no idea what technical advantages these things have.
You mean other than the fact that they're 100 times our size, sir?
The remark was accompanied with a wink, indicating humor, but he continued as if he didn't hear. There was no time for humor, even gallows humor.
And for all we know, they have a weakness that can be exploited. We just took the time to scan them properly and study their ship layout.
You think we'll be able to study their ship schematic enough in 1 minute and figure out a way to destroy them? What, like fly into their exhaust port and blow up their main power reactor?
Something like that.
Seems a little cliché.
She studied his face.
Do you remember anything like these things? The super dreadnought? No fleeting memories?
Lately, Proctor had been questioning him more about his vacation, his missing 3 days aboard the Constitution. The memories were still foggy, especially after Vishkane Karsa, the Dolmasi admiral, had tampered with Granger's mind, making him think he'd been peering down at the swarm homeworld. Afterwards, he thought he was remembering the swarm's point of origin, but the memory was false. And by thinking, wrongly, that he'd seen Volari 3, the Dolmasi's homeworld, he had inadvertently liberated them, thinking he was striking down the swarm. For all the good it had done them. Ever since then, the Dolmasi had rarely shown up to any battles when called upon. Some allies they were. He shook his head.
Nothing. I remember nothing of them.
Ensign Prince caught his attention.
Sir?
Granger noticed the time had elapsed.
Initiate Q jump.
Prince engaged the drive, and Granger felt the telltale momentary sway as the change in the star field on the view screen indicated the jump was successful. Quantum effects, such as the Q jump, were always a little more unpredictable, close to a large gravity well like planets.
Continue deceleration, he said. Full scan of the ships as we approach. All bands, all fields, neutron, gamma, RF, metaspace, quantum signatures, everything.
And tactical?
Proctor stood near her post in the rear of the bridge. The eyes of the tactical crew were on her and Granger.
Show them our belly again. That section of the ship is already dark. The crew is evacuated from decks 1 through 5, correct?
Yes, but...
Extend the evacuation to deck 8.
Proctor looked flustered. She never looked flustered. The battle was getting to her, or more likely, he was getting to her.
Sir, engineering starts on deck 7. Are you going to evacuate engineering?
No, engineering crew stays.
Tim, this is highly irregular.
There's nothing regular about this, Shelby. Why would you expect it to start getting regular now?
Why was she calling him out in front of the crew? If she pushed any harder, he'd have to relieve her. He couldn't have this kind of public questioning of his orders, especially not in the middle of a battle. But deep inside, he knew why. Ever since Lieutenant Valls had come back through that singularity, ever since a swarm-controlled fishtail had woken up and started fingering Granger as a former swarm agent, confirming what Valls was saying, that the pilot had talked to Granger on the other side, acting for the swarm. It was getting to her. That much was obvious. It was making her doubt his orders, wondering if every action he took was still controlled by the swarm. He needed to figure out a way to regain her complete trust. She was too valuable an asset to lose, and if she didn't shape the hell up, he would lose her. That word lingered in his mind. Asset. Was she only an asset to him? Another human brick to hurl at the enemy? Another tool in his mission for complete and total victory? But it was true, wasn't it? He himself was a tool. They were all tools. When it came to the survival of the species, none of them mattered individually. Each of them, as a member of the pack, as a carrier of the precious genetic instructions that made the human race viciously fight for survival, was expendable. Including Proctor, including Granger. She had to understand that.
We're all bricks, Commander.
He looked her in the eye. The pain behind her gaze told him she understood.
Very well, sir,
she said with a curt nod.
And send word to the CAG. I need some more human bricks. Word to the CAG. I need some more human bricks.
Chapter 10. Flight Combat Operations Center, ISS Warrior. Indira, Britannia Sector. Commander Pierce stared at the roster. The list of 150 men and women who'd committed their lives and their deaths to the safety of the warrior, and by extension the safety of all humanity. They've signed up for this, he thought to himself. All of them. Except had they? Had any of them really signed up for this? Sure, fighter pilots weren't drafted, but humanity had not signed up for this war. It was thrust upon them. It was a gift from the Russians, or the Domasi, or Avery and Isaacson, or whoever else the conspiracy theorists insisted were involved in starting the war. He'd signed up. Because of his father. All the Pierces go military, for 300 years ever since the First Colonial War. His father had insisted. The old man had hinted that any Pierce that did not graduate at the top of his or her class at the Royal Fleet Academy on Britannia was a waste of space. So with a combination of guilt and familial duty, Tyler signed up and graduated at the top of his class. It was what Pierces do. But this Pierce wasn't happy about it. That he wasn't happy about the decision staring him in the face. Finally, after another 10 seconds of indecision, the voice in his ear erupted again.
Commander, we need those fighters now. Pick 30 and be done with it.
I can't pick who lives and dies anymore, he whispered into the comm.
Tyler,
began Commander Proctor in a softer voice.
You can do this. I know it's hard. 30 will die. But they'll save thousands, maybe millions. And those pilots will be heroes.
He sighed.
Will they? Or will they just be victims? If you don't act now, Commander, we'll all be victims.
Fine, he said, his voice hoarse. He selected 30, starting with the A's and ending with the H's. Alphabetical.
Sending orders now, sir. Thank you, Commander, she said. Proctor out.
He keyed in an instruction to the computer to open a comm link to the selected fighters and their pilots. He cleared his throat.
If you can hear this, you are receiving an order for an Omega run. Launch immediately. Accelerate to maximum toward the Super Dreadnought at 15 Mark II. Unload your torpedoes and your guns on the target before final impact.
He flipped the comm off and slumped back in his seat. His assistants, Lieutenant Schweitzer and Ensign Spiriti, gave him grim, significant looks. They all knew that they would have lost at least 30 pilots anyway in a normal fighter battle, but this way felt far, far worse. It felt inhuman. It was like he lost his humanity with every Omega run order. He glanced at the picture of himself and his wife, their 2 children draped over their laps as they posed for the camera in some forest on York. It was what he fought for, what kept him alive. With a miracle, they might win the war, but the greater miracle would be keeping their souls. But the greater miracle would be keeping their souls. Chapter 11. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Indira, Britannia Sector. Granger watched the sensor readout, waiting for just the right moment. The fighters raced out of the bay, all 30 of them targeting the heart of one of the super dreadnoughts. Once they had formed up into a regular pattern, the Warrior could commence firing, but for now they risked hitting one of their own birds. Not that it mattered. They'd be dead anyway, in a matter of 30 seconds. They felt awful for thinking it, but it was true. They formed up into a ring and Granger gave the order.
Open fire!
All the functioning mag rails on the Warrior surged to life, blasting the slugs out at another 12 kilometers per second in addition to the 50 kps speed of the ship itself. In response, the 2 super dreadnoughts unleashed their own hell on the Warrior, raking her underside with dozens of antimatter beams. The ship shuddered. A moment later, a blast several decks below threw the entire bridge crew up against their restraints. One officer who'd removed his and forgotten to refasten it was thrown up against the ceiling, where his head hit a light fixture. Granger could tell the man was dead before he hit the floor.
Hell breach is up through Deck 7,
yelled Proctor.
One of the engineering compartments is compromised. If we lose main power, there's no way to restore it.
He could tell the targeted ship was already starting to move laterally, and as a result, over 2/3 of their mag rail slugs missed. But it didn't matter. The other ship couldn't evade them. They were coming in too fast. A few moments later, the dreadnought lit up with the brilliant explosions as some of the slugs found capacitor banks or auxiliary power lines. In a few more seconds, it too would be destroyed. 2 super dreadnoughts down in only one battle. Not bad, he thought to himself. Another explosion ripped through the lower decks, this time manifesting as power overloads at several junctions and terminals, resulting in dangerous electrical flashes and fires across the bridge. And all it took was me destroying the Warrior, he thought grimly. But a moment later, the view on the screen made his stomach lurch. 30 shimmering points of light appeared suddenly, right in front of the super dreadnought. They only lasted for a second, because almost immediately after they appeared, all 30 winked out, as each fighter slammed into one, disappearing in a flash.
Shit!
Another explosion.
Tim,
Proctor began.
we've lost main power. We're not getting it back. Reyna is not responding down in engineering. It's over.
He closed his eyes.
Vincent Prince, how much thrust can you give me?
The young man, his face white, looked at his console.
Mains are out, but I can give you half lateral thrust and 1/4 aft.
Steer us in. Clip them on their side. With any luck, whatever's left of us will ricochet into the other one.
5 seconds left. The massive ship grew quickly on the screen as the Warrior's incredible velocity propelled it toward a direct collision.
So this was goodbye,
he thought.
For real this time.
2 seconds. 1. The super dreadnought disappeared. Did they hit it? Were they all dead? He looked around at his dazed bridge crew. He imagined death would be a lot more painful and fiery.
Where the hell did it go?
Ensign Diamond at Tactical studied his sensor display.
Unknown, sir. We flew by the other one, but the target itself just disappeared.
His brow furrowed.
Oh. Sir, I'm reading a Q-jump signature. The target Q-jumped away, location unknown.
Granger pounded on his armrest. Proctor's voice cut through his disbelief with more bad news.
And sir, the one we passed is accelerating, catching up to us. It'll match our speed in less than a minute. Weapons range in 80 seconds if they maintain this acceleration.
Damn it. I can't even get suicide right today. Damn it. I can't even get suicide right today.
Chapter 12. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Indira, Britannia Sector.
What's our vector? What kind of orbit are we in?
Ensign Prince, a little dazed at being still alive, shook his head a few times before responding.
It looks like we're coming in toward the planet on a highly inclined orbital plane, though, we're far above escape velocity. Should take us just above the atmosphere before spitting us out into open space.
Commander Proctor added.
And we'll fly right by a few of the swarm carriers on the way past. By the time we pass them, that other super dreadnought will have caught up to us.
How long?
Granger watched the planet grow larger as they approached. The billowing mushroom clouds had almost completely shrouded the view of the surface. He wondered how the rest of his fleet had fared against the remaining swarm carriers.
50 seconds,
said Proctor.
And the fleet?
She glanced at her task force tactical display, which Lieutenant Diaz had been using for fleet coordination.
Holding their own, for the most part. 5 swarm carriers destroyed. We've paid for it with 9 lost cruisers.
Doing the math in his head, he came to the grim conclusion. The swarm was going to win this one.
30 seconds until dreadnought intercept. Around the same time we'll pass 3 carriers.
Proctor looked up.
If we angle ourselves just right, we might be able to take out all 3.
He flashed a wry, gallows humor grin.
A chance to redeem our previous failed suicide attempt? Very well. Do it.
Another dread silence fell over the bridge as the crew at the navigation station made their calculations, and Ensign Prince reoriented the ship and adjusted the orbital vector slightly to plow them right into one of the carriers. With any luck, they'd careen right through it and into a second one on the same path. Hopefully the blast front would take out the third hovering just out of the flight path. It was as good a death as any, taking out 3 whole carriers.
Sir,
began Ensign Prucha.
Incoming transmission.
Please say Admiral Zingano finally showed up,
thought Granger.
Source?
I may be mistaken, but it looks like it's coming from the dreadnought.
Granger spun around.
It's coming from the swarm?
Looks like it, sir.
He blinked in surprise at his console.
And it's visual.
Granger, his head half cocked toward the front view screen, nodded incredulously.
Put it through.
The image of the devastated planet disappeared, replaced by another image, that of an alien. Not swarm, not Domasi. A third alien race, vaguely human but with tighter skin, almost a bluish tint.
Captain Granger, will you make alliance with us?
Granger's automatic reply sounded surreal in his mouth.
We will.
They were the only words to say, really.
And who do we make alliance with?
The 5th house of the Concordat of 7. You've shown us we can throw off our masters, just as you did with the Dolmasi.
Granger cut his hand across his throat, eyeing Ensign Prucha, who muted the audio. He shot a glance at Commander Proctor.
It's gotta be a trick. They have us at their mercy.
Maybe, she said. But what choice do we have?
He shrugged and nodded toward Prucha, who restored the audio.
Very well. To prove your sincerity, would you mind neutralizing the Valerisi carriers that are just now coming in range?
He said, using the name the swarm used for themselves. The alien, to Granger's disbelief, nodded once.
By all means, Captain. Please maneuver your ship around ours to shield yourselves. We detect that you cannot take much more damage.
Granger signaled Ensign Prince, who maneuvered the warrior as the alien had suggested, putting the dreadnought in between it and the 3 incoming swarm carriers.
Captain, the dreadnought is opening fire on the carriers,
began Ensign Diamond.
Full spread of antimatter beams.
The view screen split, half still displaying the new alien and the other half showing the carnage. The dreadnought had at least 10 times the number of beam turrets as the carriers, and within 15 seconds of the flyby, the targets were in ruins, breaking apart and blazing through the upper atmosphere.
Captain,
said Proctor, her voice betraying her disbelief.
Receiving word from the fleet. The rest of the carriers are pulling out. One already made a Q-jump out.
She looked up at him.
Shall I order pursuit?
He nodded quickly, still paralyzed by disbelief himself. The new twist of events had happened so suddenly, so illogically, that he was still trying to process it.
New contact, sir,
said Ensign Diamond, who broke out into a grin.
It's Admiral Zingano and his fleet.
The dreadnought broke off from their escort vector and accelerated toward another swarm carrier that was blasting away from the planet, trying to make its escape. Over 100 green beams lanced out from the dreadnought, overwhelming the carrier. The dreadnought eclipsed the fiery death throes of the much smaller ship.
Maybe they detected Zingano's imminent arrival and decided to make their move?
Maybe,
said Granger.
I suppose we'll get their explanation shortly.
He watched as the dreadnought reoriented itself and rejoined Warrior's flight vector. He couldn't help but feel he'd cheated, or that someone had cheated. It was too easy. They were about to die. Twice.
That alien had better have a damn good story. That alien had better have a damn good story.
Chapter 13. Senator Joseph P. Hill Memorial Shipyards, Athens, Alabama, Earth. Vice President Isaacson smiled as widely as his strained, exhausted cheeks would allow him to. As the hovering cameras nearby zoomed backward into the air and panned wide, he relaxed the rictus grin a bit, knowing that the actual crowd assembled on the street below wouldn't be able to see him as closely as the ever-present cameras. Wouldn't be able to see him sigh ever so slightly. They would never see him like she saw him. She saw everything. She was always there, in his every waking moment, governing his thoughts, his feelings, and of course his actions, and to a lesser extent his words. At least his spoken words. But he had to tightly govern his running mental commentary. He couldn't even call her bitch anymore. Not in his mind, at least. Not without suffering ungodly agony. An unfortunate side effect of having 30 mind and emotion reading implants capable of delivering 54 millijoules of brain-bending pain apiece. In certain moments, talking with certain senators or Russian agents with whom he was still trying to uphold the facade of agitator-in-chief, he allowed himself to unload on President Avery, calling her every filthy name his frenzied mind could grasp at. With those people, he had to maintain appearances of a murderous traitor, and so she allowed him to play the part. But with everyone else, with the public, he was to be the cheerleader, Avery's #1 surrogate. Thank you. You're too kind, he said, his voice amplified by a microphone hovering just a meter in front of him. Thousands of people had crammed into the plaza and neighboring streets to see him in person. It was just another ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newest heavy cruiser coming off the line at the nearby shipyard. But the people of Athens, Alabama, were proud of their contribution to the war effort. It was their 5th ship completed since the start of the war. All 4 of the previous ships had been lost, of course, just like over 60% of all newly built ships these days. But the pride of the crowd was palpable. You know, back when I was interning for Senator Hill, he paused for dramatic effect. I guess some of you may have heard of him. The crowd roared. The late Senator Hill was, in fact, an Alabama native. Back when I interned for old Joe, he told me, he says, Eamon, the people in my senatorial district are simply the best people in the galaxy. More roars from the crowd. Isaacson continued. The crowd was putty in his hand. He may have hated his forced servitude at the scheming hands of President Avery, but this part, the adoration of a war-weary crowd, this part he loved. Now, he says to me, Eamon, the people in my senatorial district are simply the best in the galaxy, he said again, expertly knowing that the key to any good political speech was repetition, repetition, repetition. And do you know why they're the best, Eamon? It's because they never give up. They never give up. They're the most badass, unbreakable people on the planet. They never give up. And you know what, Eamon? You know what? If the swarm ever comes back, the shitheads... I'm sorry, folks, Senator Hill was pretty colorful, if you know what I mean. The shitheads will never know what hit them. He paused to let the crowd scream ecstatically again. Old Senator Hill was an Alabama legend, especially here where he grew up. It didn't matter that Isaacson was making up the story about the old bastard. 100% blatant fabrication. The crowd ate it up. When old Joe died, a few years later, he continued slowly, adding a note of heaviness to his voice. The crowd hushed. When old Joe died, I found a letter in my mailbox the next week. He'd included it in his will. Imagine, little old me, just a snot-nosed intern getting a personal letter from a United Earth Senate legend. I opened it, hands trembling. The crowd was utterly silent. I pulled out the letter, I read it again. Tears came to my eyes. He continued, filling in with meaningless words as he racked his brain for what to say next. There was no letter. He'd only interned for the old codger for a week before the man died suddenly of a heart attack during a blowjob prostitute, and Isaacson had never even met him. But he needed a good line for the crowd. And through my tears I saw the firm, handwritten signature of that patriot, that giant of a man. He cleared his throat, summoning a good show of emotion. The words he wrote are these, and I quote, "A sacrifice made in the service of your fellow countrymen is no sacrifice at all." Brilliant, Eamon, he thought as the crowd went wild. He held up a hand. Thank you for your sacrifice. I know you've seen hunger, pain, loss, and seemingly endless war. And through it all, you've persevered. You've given us a fighting chance against our mortal enemy. You've given us this, he said, indicating the giant cruiser in dry dock about a kilometer away. He slipped in a few more anecdotes, some good old-fashioned, folksy, homespun wisdom, pumped up the crowd with a bit more cheerleading, and finally called it a day. 3 speeches in a row, 3 starship naming ceremonies, 3 ceremonially broken bottles against tungsten iridium hulls, hundreds of local dignitaries and factory chiefs and shift managers, thousands of handshakes. His hand ached, his back ached, his head ached, and when he finally collapsed on his bed at the end of the day, he groaned when his comm card alarmed, indicating she wanted to talk to him. He couldn't mentally swear at her. He couldn't slather her with creative insults and curses. All he could do was take a deep breath and tap his fingers against his leg in the same rhythm as the syllables of one particular insulting, vulgar phrase. He couldn't think the words. She'd hear that, and she'd punish him severely for it. But he tapped the rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. It was his only release. The only way he could impotently strike back at her. The alarm sounded again, and one of his 30 implants buzzed slightly. Not painfully, but as a warning. Don't keep me waiting, Mr. Vice President. I'm not a patient woman. He pulled his comm card out and tapped it. Yes, Madam President. Good work today, Mr. Isaacson. I trust you're not too exhausted. 3 naming ceremonies. 3? That sounds downright tiresome. She laughed. Tap, 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 tap. Don't worry, I'll let you sleep soon. Any word from Ambassador Volodin? Not yet. He says an audience with Marakov is highly unlikely, but that he'd pull all his strings to arrange it. Good, said Avery. We need to get you in there. Much depends on it. If I may ask, Madam President, why not just meet him yourself? If the message you want delivered to him is that important, wouldn't it carry more diplomatic force if it was the President of United Earth delivering it? She laughed. Oh, Eamon, you're so incredibly naive sometimes. Tap, 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 tap. Oh? He couldn't help but let a hint of sarcasm seep into his voice. Luckily, she let it slide. His implants remained silent. Mr. Isaacson, the message I want delivered is one that is suited uniquely to you. She laughed again and added, Besides, it wouldn't look good at all if I were the one to negotiate with Mr. Marakov. Just think of the optics. I'm the badass, no-nonsense, take-no-prisoners president of United Earth. I can't be seen talking to war criminals. He'd been halfway through sitting up to walk to the bathroom, but he froze. I beg your pardon, Madam President? Was she sending him off alone, outside her influence to talk to her mortal enemy?
You heard me. In person, in his own office. You need to get inside his head, see what he's thinking. Otherwise, we don't stand a chance. He heard her take a sip of a drink she was holding, the clink of the ice rung against the glass. She continued, "And if that doesn't work, then you'll sabotage his secret computer network. Preferably with a bomb or something, in full view of live television cameras. The whole galaxy will see it live." She laughed again. "Should cause quite a stir, don't you think? People will see that we're finally striking back against the Russian bastards. Oh, don't worry, I know what you're thinking. I'm sure you'll escape the blast. Well, reasonably sure. Ha!"
Tap, tap, tap. Chapter 14. Britannia. Vols wanted to take any chances with her. Commander Proctor had done some tests involving metaspace signals and determined that, while Fishtail was unconscious, the swarm was not able to control her or send and receive single finger. It was the only thing that made sense. A transparent panel had been set up around her to prevent medical staff and other patients from inadvertently brushing up against her skin. But otherwise, sickbay still made the most sense as the place to keep her. That way she could be easily kept under sedation and under constant monitoring. He watched her, just as he had almost every evening for 2 months, when he wasn't flying his bird, or training his squad, or sleeping and eating. He was here. Was she in there somewhere? Could she be saved? Proctor had assured him that she could be saved, just like Granger. But he had trouble believing his XO when he passed away the long hours watching her.
"If you keep watching her this much, I think I'm going to rename you Stalker. Tyler Stalker Vols."
Vols gave a short, gruff laugh. "What do you know about stalking, Space Champ?" She stood next to him, watching the former pilot sleep.
"Clearly not as much as you, Ballsy. Though if a guy were to stalk me, I think I'd want him to at least leave me some chocolates or something. Maybe some small talk. If I was really drunk, maybe a quickie."
He looked at her, aghast.
"Kidding, Ballsy."
She turned to him.
"Seriously, man, you're obsessed. What's up? You can't go on like this, pining over her. You guys weren't even an item, right? I mean, she was married, has a kid."
He waved a hand dismissively. "No, nothing like that. It's just... she was on my team. And she threw herself into that thing to save the ship, and she made me promise to go tell her kid that everything would be okay, and I don't know. For a while she was dead, and then miraculously she was alive, and I rescued her, but now she's in limbo, and I'm just hung up, Space Champ. It's hard to explain. He wasn't even sure why he was there."
"Are you just scared that you'll end up the same way?"
Space Champ folded her arms, studying the sleeping pilot.
"That you'll go into the void and then come back changed? Different? That you'll lose yourself? Demon possession?"
He rolled his eyes. "This isn't some B-movie space horror show."
"And yet, there she is. Changed. Taken over by an alien race. Sounds like a horror show to me,"
she said. "Yeah." He rubbed his arms. He had clasped his hands behind his back for so long that they had started to prickle. "I guess this is a horror show. Could happen to any of us at any time. Dogtown, taken by the swarm, then killed. Those other 2 pilots, and Hanrahan, Doc Wyatt." She pat his shoulder.
"Don't worry. At least there won't be any aliens bursting out of your chest and dancing on the bar. And remember, Granger came back. If he can, so can Fishtail."
"Yeah, I know. I keep telling myself that." Space Champ turned to leave, then paused.
"You know why they call me Space Champ?"
Didn't you just pick it because it sounded cool?"
"You know you don't pick your own call sign. No, they called me Space Champ when I was first assigned to the Oregon. I wore my hair in a bun, and the guys said I looked like that cartoon character from when we were kids. Remember her? Space Champ? A zany, happy-go-lucky nerd girl turned space pirate? Robbed from the rich inner solar plutocrats and gave to the poor?"
Vols shrugged. "I played basketball, never watched many cartoons."
"Well,"
continued Space Champ,
the thing with that cartoon was, Space Champ was a goon. A total gamer girl with bad grooming habits and crazy hair that she wrapped up in a bun. When those jocks called me Space Champ, It wasn't a compliment, believe me. Behind my back, they called me, and I quote, Eterniverge, referring to their belief that I'd never get laid in my entire life. That first week was horrible. You know what I did? I got in that cockpit, and I decided that I'd be the best goddamn fighter jock any of those bastards had ever seen. I put up a friggin' full-size poster of Space Champ on my locker. I plastered her name on my helmet, and I owned it. I wasn't going to let them define who I was. And by the time a month had passed, I was the best. You know why?
Why?
Mainly because the rest of them were killed by the swarm. They had it coming, the bastards. God rest their souls.
Jay crossed herself. Balls had forgotten she was religious.
But I lived. I survived. I fought my way through and clawed my way out when those other wankers got themselves killed. By the time I left, Space Champ was my badge of honor. It was my title that said, "Suck it, bitch, I'm better than all you sorry asses."
She turned and pointed to Fishtail.
She survived. Both because she's a kick-ass pilot and because you risked everything to bring her back. She had the lady balls to put her life on the line for all of us, throwing herself into that thing to save the ship. Something tells me she's gonna fight this thing and win. You just watch.
Balls shook his head, finally turning to face her. You haven't talked to it, Space Champ. You don't know. You don't know what it's like. It's completely taken her. When she talks, it's all swarm, all hate and malice and chest-thumping and dick-waving about how they'll overcome us all and make us all friends. Or kill us all if we resist. I just worry that in spite of her bravery, in spite of me bringing her back, that we've lost her after all. He bit his lip. And they'll have to go back to that house again and tell them that their daughter and his mother is dead again. I don't know if I can handle that. He was looking her in the eye, but she seemed distracted. Following her gaze, he scanned sickbay for what Space Champ was looking at and gasped. Fishtail was awake and staring right at him with dead, glassy eyes. A joyless smile curled the edge of her lips. He put his hand on the window. One of the nurses noticed the monitor beeps announcing Fishtail's return to consciousness and raced over to the transparent enclosure, jabbing a few times at the automatic IV to dispense a new dose of tranquilizer. A few moments later, she closed her eyes again and fell asleep. That look on her face. He shuddered. The expression had horrified him. But there was still hope, wasn't there? She's got to be in there. He pulled his hand back from the window and made a decision. He needed to talk to her. Break past the monster and reach Fishtail and bring her home. Again. And reach Fishtail and bring her home. Again. Chapter 15. Conference Room, ISS Lincoln. High Orbit, Britannia.
She calls herself Vice Imperator Scythia Krull. Says her people, the Skiora, have been servants of the Swarm for thousands of years. She claims that once they realize that